It is the summer of 1940. The skies above the English Channel have become a killing ground. Every morning, young men on both sides of the water climb into machines of aluminium and petrol, knowing with quiet certainty that some of them will not return. The Battle of Britain is raging, and Germany's Luftwaffe holds a terrifying numerical advantage. But somewhere in the grey corridors of Whitehall, and in the rather more cheerful offices of a department known officially as the Political Warfare Executive, a small group of men is cooking up something that has nothing to do with aeroplanes, radar, or ammunition. They are inventing a lie. A spectacular, audacious, utterly ridiculous lie. One so brazen that if it worked, it would be one of the most effective psychological weapons of the entire war. And it did work. For several weeks in late 1940 and into 1941, German Luftwaffe pilots began refusing, point blank, to fly certain routes over the English Channel. Their commanding officers were baffled. The men were not cowards. They had proven themselves again and again in the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. So what, in the name of the Reich, had gotten into them? The answer was a rumour. One carefully planted, expertly tended rumour. About a weapon that did not exist. One German pilot, debriefed after being shot down over Kent, reportedly told his interrogators that he had been warned specifically not to fly low over certain coastal stretches at night. His comrades had told him that the British had developed a device, something to do with electromagnetism, or perhaps microwaves. The details were always vague. That could reach up and seize control of an aircraft's engine, cutting it dead in mid-flight without warning. Several men in his squadron, he said, had already refused night sorties over the Channel on precisely these grounds. Their commanding officer had reportedly threatened them with disciplinary proceedings. They had gone anyway. The ground crews, not the pilots. This one British invention, if you can call a fabricated story an invention, changed the psychological landscape of aerial warfare. And most people have never heard of it. To understand why the British were resorting to invented weapons in the first place, you have to appreciate just how desperate the situation was in the autumn of 1940. The fall of France in June had been catastrophic. Britain now stood alone against a German war machine that had swept through Europe with a speed and ferocity that had left the world stunned. Churchill's famous speeches were magnificent, but speeches do not shoot down Messerschmitts. The Royal Air Force had performed miracles during the summer months, but by September the strain was beginning to tell. Fighter Command was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements. The airfields of southern England had been bombed repeatedly. Radar stations had been damaged, and yet somehow the RAF was still in the fight. Barely, but still fighting. The question for British planners was not merely how to win battles in the air. It was how to make the Germans think twice before starting them. Conventional weapons were stretched to their limits. There were not enough Spitfires, not enough Hurricanes, not enough trained pilots. The anti-aircraft defences over southern England were formidable in places, but patchy in others. What the British needed was something that could impose a cost on the Germans without requiring physical resources that simply did not exist. They needed a weapon that lived entirely in the mind. The Political Warfare Executive and its predecessor organizations, which had been experimenting with black propaganda since the late 1930s, understood this perfectly. The challenge was to create a story credible enough that trained, experienced military men would believe it. Pilots are not, by nature, a superstitious lot. They are engineers at heart. They understand machines. Any story about a British secret weapon would need to have a technical veneer. It would need to sound plausible, even if the actual mechanism remained conveniently vague. The solution emerged from a confluence of genuine British research and creative invention. In the late 1930s, British scientists had been conducting real experiments with directed energy, radio waves, microwave emissions, and electromagnetic fields. None of this research had produced anything remotely resembling a weapon capable of stopping an aircraft engine. But it had produced enough technical vocabulary, enough genuine laboratory activity, that a rumor could be built around it like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. The story, as it was carefully fed into German intelligence networks through a variety of channels, neutral diplomats, double agents, overheard conversations in Swiss hotels, doctored technical documents, went something like this. British scientists at a facility somewhere on the southern coast had developed a device capable of projecting a focused beam of electromagnetic energy at low-flying aircraft. This beam, operating at a specific frequency, would interfere with the aircraft's ignition system, causing the engine to cut out without warning. The effect, supposedly, was instantaneous and irrecoverable below a certain altitude. Fly too low over the wrong stretch of coastline, and your engine would simply stop. The weapon was given no official name in the disinformation campaign, which was itself a clever touch. Named weapons can be investigated, catalogued, debunked. A nameless device, described in whispers and fragments, is far harder to pin down. Different versions of the story gave different operating frequencies, different ranges, different altitudes of effectiveness. The inconsistency was not a flaw in the plan. It was the plan. Inconsistent rumors are paradoxically harder to disprove than consistent ones, because they suggest a messy, organic truth rather than a manufactured narrative. The facilities credited with the device were vaguely described as being somewhere between Dover and Dungeness, an area already bristling with genuine radar installations and coastal defenses. The genuine hardware already present along that coastline lent visual credibility to the story. Pilots who had flown over the area had seen the towers, the aerials, the cable runs. They did not know what those installations did. Now they were being told that at least some of them could reach up and swat them from the sky. The key conduit for the disinformation was the network of double agents run by Britain's MI5 under the so-called double-cross system, officially designated XX. By 1940, British intelligence had turned virtually every German spy operating in Britain. These agents sent back a steady stream of false information to their Abwehr handlers in Hamburg and Berlin. Most of this information concerned military deployments, troop strengths, and coastal defenses. But woven into the traffic were occasional mentions of extraordinary scientific developments, just enough to be tantalizing, never enough to be conclusive. One agent in particular, known by the code name Tate, a Dane named Wolf Schmidt, who had parachuted into Cambridgeshire in September 1940 and been immediately turned by MI5, reportedly passed on fragments of what he described as overheard conversations about a new coastal device. Schmidt was considered highly reliable by his German handlers. His messages carried weight. When Tate mentioned something, Hamburg listened. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The results began to manifest in the intelligence reports coming back through British channels within weeks. German pilots were asking questions about the coastal defences that went beyond the usual tactical queries about anti-aircraft positions and barrage balloon heights. They wanted to know specifically about electromagnetic installations. Some refused night missions that took them below 500 feet over certain stretches of the coast. A few incidents were recorded and passed back to London through the double-cross traffic, of crews aborting sorties and reporting instrument failures that their ground crews could not subsequently reproduce. Whether those instrument failures were psychosomatic, pilots so convinced that their engines might cut out that they interpreted every stutter and vibration as evidence of the beam, or simply convenient excuses to avoid a mission they feared, is impossible to say with certainty. But either way, the effect was real. Men were not flying routes they would otherwise have flown. Attacks on certain coastal targets were being approached at higher altitudes than tactical doctrine would normally dictate, reducing their accuracy. The lie was costing Germany real operational effectiveness. The Germans were not, of course, simply credulous victims. The Luftwaffe had its own scientific advisors, and the Abwehr had experienced technical analysts. At some point, exactly when is unclear, as German records from this period are patchy. They began actively trying to debunk the engine-stopping beam story. Test flights were conducted along the relevant stretches of coastline, with instruments measuring electromagnetic emissions. Nothing unusual was detected. Aircraft engines did not cut out. The beam did not appear to exist. But here is where the British deception demonstrated its real sophistication. By the time German investigators concluded that the beam was probably not real, or at least not operational, the story had already done its work. Weeks of hesitation had passed. Missions had been postponed. Routes had been altered. Tactical habits had formed around the assumption that the southern coast was more dangerous than it actually was. And the psychological residue lingered. Even a disproved rumor leaves a trace of anxiety. The pilot who has been told that something terrible might happen in a certain place does not entirely lose that anxiety simply because someone tells him the original report was wrong. He has been trained to be cautious there. The habit of caution persists. The German equivalent of this kind of operation, their own psychological warfare and disinformation effort, was in some respects more sophisticated in certain technical domains, but less effective in this particular area. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe ran their own deception operations, but their management of rumor and psychological operations was often more centralized and more formal than the British equivalent. The British were better at the seemingly casual, organic spread of a story, letting it leak through neutral intermediaries, through gossip, through the apparently spontaneous observations of credible individuals. The Americans, when they entered the war after December 1941 and began collaborating closely with British intelligence, were impressed by the engine beam operation and similar efforts. American psychological warfare planners studied the techniques and adapted them for operations in the Pacific Theater and later in North Africa and Europe. The Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, incorporated many of the British lessons into their own doctrine. The idea that a technically plausible but entirely fictional weapon could impose real operational costs on an enemy became a standard part of the deception toolkit. It is worth comparing the engine beam story with another more famous British deception of the period. The cover story created to explain the RAF's improved night fighting success in late 1940 and 1941. As British radar became more effective and British night fighters began shooting down increasing numbers of German bombers in the dark, the Luftwaffe began to wonder how the British were finding them. The actual answer: increasingly sophisticated airborne radar, ground control systems, and the early development of what would become GCI, or ground-controlled interception, was something the British desperately wanted to keep secret. So they invented another story. British pilots, it was rumoured, were being fed extraordinary quantities of carrots, which improved their night vision to superhuman levels. Newspapers were fed stories. RAF pilots were photographed eating carrots. the Ministry of Food ran campaigns encouraging the civilian population to eat more carrots, partly for genuine nutritional reasons, partly to reinforce the cover story. The Germans apparently gave the carrot story some credence. What is certain is that this legend has persisted to the present day as received folk wisdom in Britain. Eat your carrots, and you will see in the dark. Most people who repeat this have no idea they are reciting a wartime propaganda message. The engine beam operation and the carrot story together illustrate something important about British wartime deception. It worked best when it was layered, when it reinforced itself through multiple channels, and when it exploited genuine technological uncertainty. The Germans knew the British were doing something clever with radar. They could see the towers. They knew night interception rates were improving. Into that genuine uncertainty, the British poured a plausible-sounding explanation that pointed away from the truth. The actual historical impact of the engine beam deception is genuinely difficult to quantify. Unlike a bombing raid or a naval battle, the effects of a psychological operation do not leave clean records. We know from decoded German signals, the product of Bletchley Park's work against Enigma traffic, much of which was not declassified until decades after the war, that there were internal Luftwaffe communications expressing concern about British coastal installations in terms that suggested the beam story had currency. We know from the double-cross traffic that the story was being received and believed, at least partially, by German handlers. What we cannot know with precision is how many missions were cancelled, how many routes were altered, how many bombs fell wide because a pilot added 200 feet of altitude to stay above a beam he half believed in. The official estimates, and these should be treated with appropriate skepticism, suggest that the operational disruption was real but modest. Perhaps a few dozen sorties affected over a period of several weeks. In the context of a battle involving thousands of flights, that may sound insignificant. But in the autumn of 1940, when Fighter Command was fighting for its life and the margin between survival and defeat was measured in single-figure numbers of aircraft, a few dozen sorties was not nothing. There are no physical exhibits of the engine-stopping beam for the obvious reason that it never existed. What survives is documentary, the files of the Political Warfare Executive, now held at the National Archives at Kew, the double-cross papers, partially released and partially still classified, the debriefing transcripts from captured Luftwaffe personnel, which make for extraordinary reading in their mixture of technical sophistication and genuine, wide-eyed credulity about what the British might be capable of. Those transcripts are perhaps the most telling legacy of the operation. Here were trained aviators, men who understood engines and aerodynamics and the physics of flight, sitting in British interrogation rooms and talking with evident sincerity about a weapon that a few men in Whitehall had invented over tea and biscuits. They had been told it existed. They had heard it from trusted comrades. They had seen the towers on the coast and assumed, not unreasonably given the general state of British scientific achievement, that those towers were doing something terrible and clever. And so they had believed it, or half believed it, which was quite enough. Return to that image of the Channel in the summer of 1940. The grey water, the white cliffs, the smoke still rising from the bombed airfields of Kent and Sussex, young men in cockpits checking their instruments, deciding whether to fly lower for a better bombing run or stay high and deliver a less accurate attack. In one cockpit, a pilot is thinking about what his squadron mate told him last week, about the beam, about the engines cutting out, about the men who didn't come back from the low-level run over Dungeness. He doesn't know whether it's true. He has no way of knowing. The British have been very careful about that. And so he stays high. He drops his bombs from an extra 200 feet. They miss by a wider margin than they would have done. He turns for home. In an office in London, a man who helped invent the beam does not know that this particular pilot made this particular decision. He will never know. That is the nature of a lie that works. It dissolves into the fabric of events, leaving no clear trace of itself, only consequences. Britain survived the Battle of Britain by the most ferocious combination of technological innovation, human courage, organizational brilliance, and sheer luck. The engine-stopping beam contributed to that survival in the way a single brick contributes to a wall. You cannot point to it and say the wall stands because of that brick, but take enough bricks away and the wall falls. The most powerful weapon the British deployed in the summer and autumn of 1940 was not the Spitfire, magnificent as she was. It was not radar, extraordinary as that technology proved. It was something older and stranger, and in many ways more human. The capacity to look an enemy in the eye, across the grey water of the Channel, through the static of a radio signal, through the mouth of a turned spy, and tell him, with perfect conviction, an absolute and utter lie, and to make him believe it just enough, just long enough, that it mattered.